Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our ATS online lecture today with Dr. Ellinor Morack. Very exciting topic. And Dr. Ellinor is a research and teaching associate at Bamberg University in Germany. She holds an MA and a Doctor of Philology, I think, in history from Freie University in Berlin. She did some doctoral studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and then moved to Bamberg, where she is now in 2015. Her period is the Ottoman Empire, which we're going to be hearing about, and modern Turkey. And she has published a book and several articles on the aspects of abandoned property in the Greek-Turkish population exchange, history of emotions, memoirs as historiography in Turkey, the phantom pain of non-Muslim labor in early Republican Turkey, parliamentary history, and most fascinating to me, Gog and Magog in late Ottoman texts. And I shall be looking that one up later as soon as we go offline. She currently works on her habilitation thesis about the politics of remembering the Muslim guerrillas in the Turkish War of Independence. And she is the principal investigator of the DFG-funded network project Post-Ottoman Transformations, which is currently ongoing. And her book, Dowry of the State, is soon to be available in some diverse languages. I believe a Turkish edition is coming out, and you mentioned the possibility of a Greek edition, I think, Elena, maybe. So yes, which contains possibly that's a goal, it's an aspiration. And these new translations will contain, I believe, some new information as well. So keep your eyes on this space. So yes, Elena is here to talk to us about dispossession, confiscation, appropriation, property rights of minorities in modern Turkey. And without much further ado, I will hand over to you, Elena. Take it away.
Thank you, Gemma, very much for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I will now share my screen once I find my presentation. Whoop. That's strange. There. Okay, so can you see it? Okay, very good.
Yes, we're all good.
Okay, very good. So the building that you can see in the picture here is Çankaya Köşkü, the former official residence of Turkey's presidents in Ankara, which was in use from 1930 to 2014. Below the building, on top of the hill, whose construction was completed in 1930, so the new building was completed in 1930, there are three more in the picture. These are a villa on top of the hill, right next to the building, to the right, and two small vineyard houses, one of them further right up on the hill and one below here, which you can see quite clearly. These buildings were used by Mustafa Kemal from 1934. His name was Atatürk, and his staff already from 1922. Mustafa Kemal, who was looking for a quiet place for himself, is said to have taken a liking to the property in 1922. Back then it was located in the outskirts of Ankara. So the local Muslim notables purchased it from a certain Bulgurzade Tevfik Effendi, a well-known merchant, and presented it to Mustafa Kemal. While Kemal is said to have insisted that the army own the estate and not him, Çankaya became his official residence as president of the Republic in 1924, up until the opening of a new, much bigger presidential residence in 2014, which is also a story in itself, which is a lot about property and dispossession. All presidents of Turkey used Çankaya Köşkü as their residence. In 2007, Sonal Yalçın, a well-known Turkish journalist, caused a minor scandal by publishing a piece in Hürriyet, a very well-known daily paper, pointing out that the original owner of Çankaya Köşkü had been a local Catholic Armenian merchant, Ohannes Kasabian. This was true. Yalçın, however, wrote that Ohannes Kasabian had sold the property to another merchant, Vurguluzade Tevfik Efendi. This story was soon challenged by Ohannes Kasabian's grandson, Edward Çuhacı, who wrote a letter to Yalçın pointing out that the property had not been sold, but confiscated during the deportation of Ankara's Armenians in August 1915. Çuhacı, who reported that the family had managed to flee to the safety of Istanbul and that they had never been compensated for their property, had left Turkey for Canada in 1957. The letter was published in an Armenian newspaper in Istanbul, but not by Yalçın. My colleague Zeynep Kezer has discussed the history of Çankaya Köşkü as an example for the place of Armenian and generally non-Muslim historical buildings in architectural history and that of urban development in Turkey. In this talk, I would like to use it as an introduction to a connected issue, that of the legal texts and procedures that Turkish lawmakers and administrators used to confiscate and appropriate first Armenian and Syriac property, and several years later, that of the Anatolian Greeks. If we for a moment leave aside the fact that Çankaya Köşkü used to be the residence of the President of Turkey, what is remarkable about the complex is not that it was built by an Armenian family and later appropriated by the state, but that the original structures, though somewhat altered, as you can see here, survive to this day, along with the building completed in 1930. The reason for their preservation is, first of all, that the buildings housed Mustafa Kemal. All over Turkey, many houses that he visited, if only for one night, are preserved and function as museums. And second, because the vineyard did not, like so many others, later fall victim to the construction of apartment buildings, but was preserved as the estate's garden. With so many of the original buildings and entire towns and villages gone, it is difficult to trace where the late Ottoman Armenians and Greek Orthodox people lived and worked, and hardly ever possible to point at assets that were transferred into Muslim Turkish hands. Yet there is something else that is harder to visualize, but has proved much more resilient to being erased. Laws concerning the dispossession of late Ottoman minorities and the transfer of their assets to Muslim hands. In this talk, I will focus on these laws and their interpretation by Muslim people in Turkey from the 1920s to the early 1960s. As I will show, the transfer of Armenian and Greek property rights continued to haunt modern Turkey well into Republican times, and possibly to this day. Why did they haunt Republican administrators and jurists? There are several reasons, yet I think two are most important. The first is that Armenian and Greek property, like the one you see here in the picture, was, as Çalar Keyder aptly put it, the dowry of the state. Houses, fields, and businesses were valuable gifts, so to speak, that the new regime tried to use, more or less successfully, to establish relationships of mutual dependency with the Muslim population, mostly the elites, but also more humble people like refugees. In this way, Armenian and Greek property was important as cement of the building of social structure, which, to stay in the picture, was under construction in early Republican times. Second, these laws and the property rights of their non-Muslim owners sit uncomfortably with the general legal framework of both the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey. Both had and have constitutions explicitly protecting the property rights of all their citizens. This is by far not unusual. Ever since the emergence of nationalism as an ideology in the late 18th century and the subsequent building of nation-states, there has been a contradiction between the liberal, universalist notion of property rights as absolutely protected, inalienable rights on the one hand, and the nationalist idea that only members of a certain ethnicity or race or religion ought to enjoy the full range of rights in a given state. More often than not, ethnicized violence against certain unwanted groups, such as Muslims in post-Ottoman Serbia and Bulgaria, was followed by their dispossession, the appropriation of their land, and their forced migration. In this case, of post-Ottoman states to the remaining Ottoman territories. This happened during and after the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78 and during the Balkan Wars. There was, however, a more traditional notion, which I think is important in this case to make the point that this is not a Muslim issue I'm talking about. So in the traditional Ottoman system, there was the idea that non-Muslims, which means Christians and Jews, people of the book, enjoyed the protection of their life, their property, and their honor in exchange for submission to Muslim rule and special taxes. This means that they would submit to Muslim rule, and they were not supposed to rise up. If they did, they would, well, the implication was that they would be killed and they would no longer be protected. And importantly, it was not an issue whether somebody was part of a majority or a minority, and which group formed a majority or minority in a certain area. So the Balkans had a Christian majority for centuries, and nobody thought of campaigning for Christian independence. Inequality was the norm. So everybody was unequal. There was not the idea that everybody ought to be equal. Whereas in nationalism, there's this very strong idea that within a certain nation state, everybody should be equal, but only those people who belong to that nation, which implies that all those who do not belong to the nation do not have the same rights. Yet most nation states have constitutions stating that all citizens have equal rights. So there's always this this tension between the two principles, which is most strongly pronounced with regard to the issue of property rights. So many nation states have had and still have restrictions on foreigners owning property in their area. And in some cases, like the Ottoman Empire, at first foreigners were not allowed to own property. So there's a tension between full liberty of and protection of property and unequal rights between people. And in modern times, majorities in a certain area have been used as arguments to claim either independence or forms of autonomy, which is what happened in the Ottoman Balkans. The violent dispossession I will talk about in the following was not an Ottoman and Turkish invention. The Ottoman and Turkish case, however, is special insofar as it is connected not only to large-scale violence and resulting forced migration of minorities, but to a genocide that committed during World War I in 1915 and 16 against the Ottoman Armenians and Syriac Christians. Unlike in the Armenian massacres of the 1890s against Armenians, it was not committed to put minorities in their place, in quotation marks. That means to force them out and appropriate their land, or alternatively, to only impoverish them and put them in an inferior place in society, but to fully and completely get rid of them. The idea of a complete end to the presence of Armenians and later of Greek Orthodox people in post-Ottoman times was new. Older notions of the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims were based on the idea of Muslim supremacy and Jewish and Christian submission. This is what I explained on this slide. By the 1910s, a small minority of Ottoman statesmen who were part of the Committee for Union and Progress thought that there was absolutely no place for Armenians and Greeks in the Ottoman state anymore. This idea was not based on Muslim tradition, but to the contrary, on the import of European ideas of racial purity and antagonism, and the deep conviction of late Ottoman statesmen that the continued presence of minorities would forever be a pretext for great power intervention into Ottoman and later Turkish affairs. They also thought, based on the Ottoman experience in the Balkans and later on that of the Greek occupation of Western Anatolia between 1919 and 1922, and the abortive Treaty of Sèvres, that the continued presence of Ottoman Christians would help to justify territorial claims in Western and Eastern Anatolia. As a result, leading Unionists and later the Turkish nationalist movement did not want any Armenians or Greek Orthodox in the country anymore. As I've already mentioned, both the Ottoman Empire and the Republic of Turkey had and have constitutions that ostensibly protect the property rights of all their citizens. Expropriation was and is only allowed if it is performed for the public good and against proper compensation. As we will see, abandoned property laws, emvali metruke, however, neither speak of a public good nor of expropriation or compensation. On the surface, they regulate the protection of property rights, while actually taking away those very rights. While this was commonly known, parliamentarians, administrators, and judges spent years, and actually decades, trying to figure out how that implicit meaning of dispossession, which was implemented in practice, could be justified with the laws in question that said quite the opposite thing. So what I will do in this talk is, I already talked about the tension between the idea of full protection of property rights and nationalism. I also already talked about economic dispossession as part of genocide and ethnic cleansing. The main part of the talk will be about a very complicated series of laws that were issued and taken back and reissued and changed, both in the Ottoman Empire and in Turkey. And I hope you will bear with me because this is something that is very hard to visualize, so I will mainly have citations from the text here. And then I will have a case study on a constitutional court decision that was taken in 1963 and is very instructive for the way in which Turkish judges interpreted these laws. The first law I would like to discuss is the temporary law, so-called temporary, known as liquidation law, Tasfiye Kanunu, in Turkish. It was published on 14 September 1915. That is more than half a year after the first deportations of Ottoman Armenians. The infamous deportation law was issued on 19 May 1915, officially as a military measure against those who opposed military action in the First World War. As several colleagues have already argued, both the deportation law and that for liquidation describe not so much a future policy, but try to regulate the ongoing practices surrounding the deportation and dispossession of Ottoman Armenians. So, of course, the law is longer. I've taken only one part of it here to show it to you. I'm trying to get the... Okay. So it says, the property, receivables, and debts that were left behind by those real or legal persons that were brought to other places in accordance with the temporary law of 14 May 1915 shall be liquidated by the courts in accordance with records drawn up separately for each person by the commissioners established for this purpose. And the rest I cannot read because it's... Anyway. The law made it very clear that a future return of those deported to other places was not anticipated. So it says, after the expiry of this period, the general provisions of the law shall apply to the lawsuits to be filed thereafter, and those who win the aforementioned lawsuits against the liquidation of their property shall not be entitled to request the property liquidated in accordance with this law. So this means that the law said property owned by people who were deported in the course of the war would be liquidated. It means it would be sold, and the money obtained by these sales would be kept in accounts in their names. And it also said that this money could be sent to their new places of residence, or if they ever returned, it would not be possible to get the property back, even if they were right about countering this decision. but they would at best get the money back. So very clearly, there's an attempt here to get people out of the country, to never have them come back home. In the first law, there's also still talk of Muslim refugees being housed in these houses, especially, and be given the land. But actually, there's a tendency in these laws that the possibility to settle Muslim refugees is mentioned less and less, unless there's a growing priority of making money out of this and not using it for refugee settlement. At the end of World War I, those Armenians and Syriacs who had survived, along with Greek Orthodox who had fled to Greece or had been deported during the war, they were deported inland, not that far away. They all returned home. They often found their houses, fields, and businesses occupied by Muslims, either influential locals or Balkan War refugees. In 1918 and 19, British and French troops occupied parts of Ottoman Anatolia, especially along the coasts and railway lines. Following a circular and a cabinet decision of the new post-war Ottoman government that stipulated that property be given back to rightful owners, Allied officers in occupied areas established commissions in charge of returning property taken away during the war. Many Armenians also took matters into their own hands. The following citation is from an area where there was no Allied officer, but this was written by it's from the memoir of a local administrator. So he says about returning Armenians. Now, the Armenians in our area, this is in Unye on the Black Sea coast, the Armenians in our area, like those everywhere else, arbitrarily seize the property of Muslims under the pretext of returning abandoned property. This is something you find very frequently in memoirs of the time. So Muslims remembering those times, they never remember what happened during the war. They start the narrative with people coming and claiming what is supposedly not theirs, or actually belongs to the state. So all these claims, whether even those that might have been right, that might have been justified, are always presented as unlawful and as an arbitrary way of just harassing the Muslim population. The desire to keep stolen property was probably an important incentive for Anatolian and Thracian Muslims to join the national movement that started to form all over present-day Turkey in the spring of 1919. By 1920, a new parliament and a government was established in Ankara, and by 1921, the reorganized Ottoman army was starting to reconquer territory from Armenian, French, British, and Greek occupations. This means that present-day Turkey had, for about 3 years, 2 governments. One internationally recognized, one in Istanbul, which was increasingly helpless and dependent on Allied support, and the new one in Ankara, which, however, had not officially changed the form of state yet, and had pledged to liberate Istanbul and the rest of the country from Allied occupations. So this is actually a civil war. It is hardly ever talked about as a civil war, but I think it is, and it's instructive to call it like this. I think it makes things easier to understand. In 1921-22, when the new Turkish army reconquered parts of Anatolia, the Christian population of these areas usually fled or was massacred. Once again, their property stayed behind. In order to regulate the treatment of this abandoned property, the new parliament in Ankara issued a law for abandoned property in April 1922. Since it formally accepted all laws issued by the Istanbul government prior to the city's full occupation in March 1920, it could not simply ignore the Istanbul government's orders for the return of abandoned property. Instead, it came up with the idea to designate the state as universal custodian of all the ownerless property in the liberated territories, that is, in those territories controlled by the Ankara government. The law now called the affected persons differently than the previous one, speaking of those who had fled or disappeared those territories. Importantly, the law, unlike its predecessor issued in 1915, stated that owners who returned would get their property back, along with the sums kept from sales, rents, etc., kept in their name. So the important passage is here, and I've highlighted it, is, however, the real estates of the returnees shall be returned to them together with the sums of money which have been deposited in trust. And what is important about this law is that it introduces this new terminology for people. So it is no longer those who have been defrauded, but it is those who have either fled, firar edan, or disappeared, mütegaib, those who disappeared. It's an active verb here. Absconded. This stipulation faced serious opposition in the Turkish Great National Assembly in Ankara. While some deputies, especially some prominent ulema, scholars of Islamic law, argued that the property was not ownerless at all, and that the law, by violating property rights, violated Islamic divine law, the Shariat. On the other hand, there were several deputies who argued that the Christians in question had lost all their rights in the Ottoman state by rising up against the state, and could therefore never return or live among the Muslim population again. And again, I have a quote here. This is a picture of this new parliament in session. As you can see, quite an overcrowded room. So a certain Mustafa Taki Efendi, deputy for Sivas, said, "The Greeks and Armenians living in Turkey have decided no longer to accept our rule. And while it is true that our book, our jurist's law, knows such a term as protected status, this term can no longer be applied to them." So this is an interesting case, because here this pre-modern notion of either submitting and being protected or rising up and losing protection is merged with this new modern idea that it is impossible to return to that state of protection. He effectively says, because of this pre-modern notion, people can never return again. And this never returning is a modern idea of, a pure nation, a nation without any minorities, without anyone who doesn't belong. Following an offensive of the Turkish army on the Western Anatolian front in August 1922, the Greek army first retreated and then fled towards the Aegean coast. The civilian Greek Orthodox population fled with them. By early September 1922, the city of Izmir housed thousands and probably more than 100,000 refugees, also including Muslims from the surrounding countryside. When the Turkish army arrived at Izmir on 9 September, the Greek army had just evacuated the city, leaving behind hundreds of thousands of unprotected people. On September 12th, a great fire broke out that quickly spread to the Greek, Armenian, and Frankish quarters of the city, Frankish meaning European. The fire raged for 4 days, and an unknown but high number of people were killed either in it or during it. When the fire had died out, the Turkish military authorities declared that the Greek population would not be allowed to go back to their villages, provided they still existed. Many Christians dwelling in Izmir had lost their homes in the fire. In the next 2 weeks, the Christian refugees waiting along the Aegean coastline and in Izmir on the quay were evacuated to Greece. When Greek, Turkish, and Allied delegations met at Lausanne in December 1922, to negotiate a new peace treaty for the Ottoman Empire, they also negotiated the great forced migration that has become known as the Greek-Turkish population exchange. The Greek part of it, and its compulsory character, however, were already a fait accompli at that point. The negotiators eventually agreed that all Ottoman Greeks would have to leave Turkish territory. Only the Greek Orthodox and Greek citizens resident in Istanbul and on the islands of Imbros and Tenedos were exempt. In turn, all Muslims from Greece would have to leave, with those living in Western Thrace being exempt. The Convention for the Greek-Turkish Population Exchange also regulated what would happen with movable and immovable property. The provisions are curiously similar to those applied already since 1915, registration and liquidation. At the end of the process, all property rights would fall to the respective state on whose territory the property was located. Exchangees were entitled to equal value compensation in the receiving country. In practice, however, most were deeply disappointed. Especially exchangees in Greece experienced massive impoverishment. In Turkey, too, exchangees, those we know about at least, were not happy with the compensation policies, but were somewhat better off because Western Anatolia, when the area most of them were settled in, or most of them went to, experienced economic growth over the next decades. I've highlighted those points that I think are quite similar to the law of 1915, insofar as they also have this incentive of not letting people return and completely severing the bond between people and their land. According to Article 18 of the Lausanne Exchange Convention, both governments were supposed to change their national laws, and I cite, with a view to ensuring the execution of the exchange. Citation ending. Ankara was not only remarkably slow in doing so, but at first ignored this rule. In April 1923, 2 months after the convention had been signed in Lausanne, the National Assembly passed a law that made the property of those mostly Greek people who had in the meantime disappeared or fled or migrated from Istanbul because they feared the Turkish army would come over, subject to the liquidation law of 1915. At this point, the Lausanne Peace Treaty had not been signed, and the Exchange Convention had therefore not yet come into force. That actually took another year. According to the Exchange Convention, these people's property rights were supposed to be liquidated under supervision of a mixed commission, which also did not yet exist in April 1923. Instead, according to law number 333, they were to be liquidated by the Turkish abandoned property commissions, and the sums obtained were to be put in custodian accounts. Article 9 of the original law of 1915, which had stated that some classes of abandoned property may be used for distribution among refugees, was annulled. The exchange was hardly ever mentioned during the debate on the bill, and those deputies who did mention it were quickly silenced. The Population Exchange Convention cleared the way for the signing of the Lausanne Treaty, which replaced the abortive Treaty of Sevres, which had in 1920 failed to end World War I for the Ottoman Empire. The Lausanne Treaty, which is enforced to this day and has not, as some people in Turkey believed, expired after 100 years, was signed on July 24, 1923, and came into force in August 1924, when the documents of ratification were deposited in Paris. The treaty is quite clear when it comes to the rights of non-Muslims in Turkey. Article 39 declares, Turkish nationals belonging to non-Muslim minorities will enjoy the same civil and political rights as Muslims. All the inhabitants of Turkey, without distinction of religion, shall be equal before the law. The devil, however, is in the details, and with respect to property rights, in Appendix number 8. The appendix, which mostly deals with a declaration of amnesty for all war-related crimes, starts with the following pledge. The powers signatory of the Treaty of Peace signed this day, being equally desirous to cause the events which have troubled the peace in the East to be forgotten. It then continues. The Turkish government, sharing the desire for general pacification with which all the powers are animated, declare their intent not to contest the measures carried out under the auspices of the Allied powers during the period between the 20th October 1918 and the 20th November 1922, with the object of re-establishing families scattered owing to the war and or replacing legitimate proprietors in possession of their goods. This means that those houses that had been given back under Allied occupation would remain in Christian hands. It also means that children and women who were originally Armenian and had been found in Muslim households and been given back to their Armenian families would remain there. The section, however, continues. However, this intention does not exclude the possibility of any revision of the above-mentioned measures in the event of a request to that effect being made by the interested parties. And then there's, you know, the idea of a commission being formed and so on. It would, in other words, be possible to counter any decision regarding houses, women, or children that had been restituted or brought back to their families at any point in the future. While this was theoretically possible for all interested parties, it is clear, since this is about countering decisions taken under Allied occupation, that it mainly concerned Muslims as claimants, who might want women, children, or houses or land back. With the coming into force of the Exchange Convention, property owned by Greek Orthodox Ottoman citizens, who with the Exchange Convention became Greek citizens, became subject to the procedures described in the Convention. While technically the property rights would only be transferred at the end of a complete appraisal of all the involved assets, both Greece and Turkey started to treat the relevant property as if they had already owned it, and used important parts of it for the resettlement and compensation of those exchangees who came to their respective country. In October 1924, the Republic of Turkey was formally established, and the Ottoman Empire officially ceased to exist. The constitution of the young republic, like that of her predecessor, pledged that private property of all citizens was protected. And I quote, "The landed or private property of any person shall not be expropriated unless its necessity for the public interest is duly recognized and its value is paid in advance in accordance with the law." The actual practices, however, had hardly anything to do with this constitutional principle. The full property rights of all the assets involved in the exchange were only transferred to the country in which they were located with the Ankara Agreement of 1930, which formally ended the population exchange between Greece and Turkey. This means that, legally speaking, the Turkish state could now freely dispose of any property that had formerly been owned by Greek Orthodox citizens. The so-called Ankara Agreement, signed on June 10, 1930, between the two governments, was very clear. I think here my text doesn't quite fill up. So, full rights of ownership in all movable and immovable property left behind in Greece by exchangeable Muslims shall be transferred to the Greek government. Article 2. Full rights of ownership in all movable and immovable property left behind in Turkey by exchangeable Greeks shall be transferred to the Turkish government. So this might actually seem like it was very, the Turkish government was very secure in having property rights over the property left behind by Greeks, but this is apparently not the case. There was in the original Exchange Convention a passage stating that people who wished to return, who were originally exchangees and who wished to return for visits or something like that, would have to get special permission by the government to do that. And there's quite a few documents that were produced in such cases, and the following one is one of them. So this is not the one, yeah. So this is a cabinet decision dated 27 April 1932. And it deals with the case of a certain Madame Eleva Corpi. So she was an exchangee, originally born in Çatalca on the coast of the Marmara Sea. And in 1932, she wished to move and live with her husband, who was an Italian citizen and a resident of Istanbul. And so she applied to the government. And note, this was in 1932, at a point when the Turkish government was already legally owning all the property left behind by Greeks. Nevertheless, the government approved her request, but curiously stated that she would be allowed to reside with her husband, provided that she does not make any claims that would imply a violation of the status of the property that has been brought about by her being an exchangee. what is also curious is that with the Treaty of Friendship and Commerce, signed also in 1930, Mrs. Corby had already gained the right to visit Turkey. But again, the request was filed, and also the permission was granted according to the, let's say, the established rules. I think the reason, oh, I must connect my electricity. It's, of course, a rookie mistake. So I think the reason is that such declarations and ongoing anxiety about the issue of return were still relevant for surviving Armenians, not Greeks. So now I'll quickly have a look at myself. Okay. So I think this timeline is kind of useless. I will switch over it. As I have already mentioned, the Lausanne Treaty is very clear with regard to the rights of minorities, which in this treaty were defined as Armenians, Greek Orthodox, and Jewish citizens of Turkey. Groups such as Syriac Christians were not mentioned, and Kurds, according to the Turkish view, were not a minority in the first place, but fellow Muslims. The Lausanne Treaty came into force in August 1924, and in 1925 and 1926, the Turkish government issued several regulations concerning property owned by minorities. In June 1926, it issued regulation number 3753, according to which abandoned property was protected by the Treaty of Lausanne, but only after the date of the coming into force of that treaty. I have to look for that. Okay, I think I don't have a slide for this. In accordance with the provisions of the Lausanne Treaty pertaining to minorities, these provisions need to be applied to abandoned property from the date of the coming into force of that treaty. This regulation and a second one issued in 1927 declared that all that property owned by people who had been deported or disappeared or fled but later returned, and which had never been administered by the state, would not be administered by the state in the future. Property that had been treated as abandoned property only after August 1924 would be returned. The survivors and returnees were allowed to enjoy their property rights. This, however, also meant the property that had been subjected to the abandoned property laws since 1915 and prior to August 1924 would not be returned to the rightful owners. So these regulations in 1926 and 1927 basically say, from the beginning of the coming into force of the Lausanne Treaty, we no longer seize property owned by Christians, but anything that happened before that belongs with us. We will not return it, and we continue to control it. I would now like to turn to the question how the category of abandoned property continued to matter in Republican times. The first example, or actually the only one, is a court case that made its way to the new Constitutional Court in 1963. Following the coup d'etat of 1960, Turkey got a new constitution in 1961, and for the first time a constitutional court. Provided there's still time, I will discuss a second case, which I will not do. On April 22, 1963, that is a mere 2 years following its establishment in 1961, the Turkish Constitutional Court, Anayasa Mahkemesi, issued a verdict in a case that had been referred to it by the 8th Chamber of the State Council, the Danıştay. Turkey's highest administrative court. The verdict was published in the Official Gazette on 31 July 1963, and I quote from that publication. Up until 1961, Turkey had never had a constitutional court. The Council of State, Shura-i Devlet, had functioned as the state's highest court, but there had never before been a court explicitly in charge of establishing the constitutionality of laws. For that reason, the verdict I shall discuss here is, among other things, also interesting to show us how the judges at the newly established constitutional court tried to work out what their job was actually about. As we shall see, they were in disagreement about the most basic points of that matter. As the verdict explains, 11 years earlier, in 1952, here I brought here is the 1961 Constitution. So again, everybody enjoys their property and inheritance rights. Rights can only be limited for the benefit of the public good. The enjoyment of property rights may not be contrary to the public good. So the property in question might have looked like this. This is of course a modern photo, but yeah, so it's quite of characteristic for Üsküdar. As the verdict explains, 11 years earlier, in 1952, a property located in İcadiye, Üsküdar, owned by an Armenian lady, the late Meryem Urkapyan of Pangaltı, Istanbul, so she lived on the European side but owned this on the Asian side, had been registered as part of an Islamic pious foundation, a waqf. This administrative act had been countered in court by her son, Boğaz Urkapyan, son and heir, who had argued that the decision was based on the incorrect assumption that his mother was fugitive and absent. So this is the terminology from the 1922 law, firari ve mütegayip. As Mr. Urkapyan had pointed out in court, his late mother had lived in Pangaltı up to her death in 1942. She had never been fugitive and absent. This means she had not been deported in 1915, and she had never left Istanbul or Turkey between 1912 and 1924. As the verdict explains, Mrs. Urkapyan's property had been taken away on grounds of the notorious Tasfiye Kanunu, the liquidation law of September 13, 1915 that I've already discussed, and a successive law of 15 April 1923. This is the one that made all property again subject to the 1915 law. As I have already mentioned, the two terms fugitive, firari, and disappeared, mütegayip, had been coined since 1922 as euphemisms referring to those people who were forced out of the territories controlled by the Turkish nationalist movement or fled the advancing Turkish army. By 1922, Armenian people who had been deported in 1915 were referred to as disappeared, while the new term fugitive was used for those surviving Armenians, Greek Orthodox, and other non-Muslims who fled Turkey between 1918 and 1922. Mr. Urkapyan's case eventually went to the Council of State, which referred the matter to the newly established Constitutional Court, asking it to decide whether or not the laws of 1915 and 1923, which were still in force, actually violated the constitutional right to the enjoyment of property rights guaranteed by Article 36 of the Constitution of 1961. The Constitutional Court ruled that the laws in question were indeed constitutional. The decision was taken with a majority vote of 8-6. Along with the majority's verdict, 2 dissenting opinions were published. All 3 texts, but especially the first 2, are highly interesting because they are a scarce case of a rather detailed discussion of late Ottoman and early Republican Turkification policies, representing 2 very different approaches to the issue. Unfortunately, the court does not provide the address of the property in question, so I don't know whether it was located, where it was located, how it looked, and whether or not it still exists. But what is characteristic here is that we have a 2-story house. Often the construction is wooden, but in other cases you simply have wood outside. And you have a little courtyard. Almost all these houses have a tiny garden. And what is also very characteristic for this area is that in many cases, an originally 2-story house would later be, they would add another story, usually illegally. So this one in the front was probably originally built like this, and the ones next door are probably, they used to be two, I think they used to be 2-story as well. The majority verdict starts by framing the problem at hand as follows. First, it is necessary to establish in which cases it is possible to today apply the temporary law of 13 September 1915 and the 15 April 1924 law. This is, no, 1923, which are the subject of the objection in question. It then states that the two laws are applicable for all people who were deported, fled, or otherwise left the country between 1915 and 1923. An exception to this rule was seen in case of the Greek Orthodox citizens of Turkey, whose property was treated according to the Greek-Turkish Population Exchange Agreement of January 1923. For all others who had joined the fugitives or disappeared, the document stated, there was no doubt that those laws need to be applied. The laws, the verdict continues, demanded the automatic transfer of property rights from the deported, fugitive, or disappeared people to the state or religious foundation's treasury. In order to establish whether or not the property rights had indeed been rightfully transferred, the court considered it necessary to find out if the people in question belonged to the aforementioned groups or not. The proper way of establishing this is its recording in writing. However, in the event of this, that is, the person's status and the transfer of their property rights not having been recorded properly, or the transfer not being recorded in documents at all, it is still legally unavoidable to accept that, according to the laws, the transfer to the treasuries has taken place. It was, the judges argued, to be unimportant whether or not both the seizing of the property and the investigation about an owners belonging to those groups had taken place before or after 1924. Any investigation after 1924, resulting in a transfer of property rights to the state, according to the verdict, was to be considered an application of a legal act that had taken place before 1924, not the legal act itself. The judges, in other words, argued that the administrations in question did not transfer the property rights. By doing so, they would have violated the stipulations of the Lausanne Agreement, protecting the minorities' property rights in Turkey, but rather they found out that those rights had long ago been transferred, belatedly performing the administrative acts involved in such a transfer. Concerning the actual question of constitutionality, the verdict states that, since in the case at hand it was not the laws as a whole, but only certain articles whose constitutionality was debated, it would only consider those articles' constitutionality. Both articles' subject was to be seen as the determination of a person's status as fugitive or disappeared, and the verdict states, there is no provision in the Constitution that could foreclose the Turkish citizens being counted as such during the crisis-ridden times of the First World War. The taking away of Mrs. Okapian's property rights, even decades after 1915, on the condition of her having been correctly counted as fugitive or disappeared, was therefore to be seen as both constitutional and lawful. Two judges wrote dissenting opinions on the verdict, and both were published in the official gazette. The first one, written by Judge Semsetin Akçoğlu, is a direct critique of the majority verdict. Reminding the court of the fact that the problem posed by the Council of State had been accepted for consideration in the Constitutional Court, Akçoğlu went on to repeat the question at hand. It is indispensable for our court to decide whether or not the provisions of the abandoned property laws, which have been considered applicable and whose abolition has been demanded, are constitutional or not. However, this has not happened. Instead, Akçoğlu wrote, the court had framed the problem differently, deciding about the constitutionality of someone being counted as fugitive or disappeared. Moreover, the majority verdict had declared that the transfer of a person's property rights to the treasury of pious foundations could not be the subject of an administrative lawsuit. This is, I think, not an important point for us here. By doing this, Akçoğlu pointed out the court had answered the wrong question. To begin with, it is the claimant's business to determine what a case is about. A case has to be scrutinized and decided within that framework. He continued. Moreover, the Constitutional Court is not supposed to decide whether or not a case falls under the responsibility of the Council of State. By nevertheless doing so, the Constitutional Court had put itself in place of the Council of State, leaving the real question of the constitutionality of both laws unanswered. Having thus lectured his colleagues about their actual job, Akçoğlu went on to criticize the majority verdict in greater detail. The majority verdict had claimed that Article 6 of the 1924 law about custodian care of abandoned property and Article 1 and 2 of the one issued in 1915 about its liquidation were about the determination of a person's status. This, Akçoğlu observed, was not the case. The articles do not include a provision to the effect how the status of fugitive or disappeared should be determined. The court's verdict does, however, argue that these provisions exist and are to be considered constitutional. Since such a provision is not part of the above-mentioned articles, we consider it inappropriate to call it the subject of this case or to decide about its constitutionality. Having lectured the majority about the actual content of the laws in question, Akçoğlu criticized his colleagues' conceptualization of the relationship between law and administrative act. In his understanding, none of the laws in question had legal force in itself. The laws, in his view, failed to define the people to be affected by them, their property, and the administrative acts to be performed in the transfer of property rights. He concluded, since the legal bond between those people and their property has not been broken, their property rights cannot possibly be considered to have been transferred. He implicitly argued that only expropriation could break up the right to property, and since this act had not been performed, the property rights were still in place. In contrast to the majority's vote, Akçoğlu also regarded the act of confiscation, not only the idea, as a necessary and indispensable part of a property's transfer to a new owner. He argued that any confiscation taking place after August 1924, that is, after the coming into force of the Lausanne Treaty, was illegal, the only exception being those performed under supervision of the Mixed Commission, so as part of the Greek population exchange. In conclusion, he stated that if the property of a person has been registered in the name of a treasury on the grounds that the owner is fugitive and the owner in fact is not, this is an illegal appropriation. No court can refuse to look into such a case by arguing that the transfer has already taken place in law. So crucially, he said that the rights were still in place, which might be true on the surface of things, but if we look at what's actually happened, people were no longer controlling their property, so it could be argued that these rights had indeed been taken away from them. I'm kind of running out of time, so I will make this very quick. So the third opinion was supported by 4 judges, including the chairman, and the 5th judge supported parts of it. And this second minority opinion stated, also criticized the majority's failure to look into the real issue at hand, namely the constitutionality of the 2 laws issued in 1915 and 1924. However, unlike the first, this verdict argued that they were not only still in force, but could still be applied. The second minority opinion, in other words, simply argued that this law was still necessary, as could be seen in this court case. It was still the case that property rights were transferred from a non-Muslim woman to the state. Therefore, these laws were still needed, and the question of constitutionality is not debated at all. It is simply not addressed in this third opinion. I think crucially, it is, and this is for conclusion, the majority verdict, which avoids to address the question asked, is the one that implicitly admits that the abandoned property laws violate the property rights of Ottoman and later Turkish citizens, and are therefore unconstitutional. The verdict admits that the laws strip these people of their property rights, which is unconstitutional. However, the verdict uses a trick, arguing that this transfer already happened in spirit prior to 1924, when the Lausanne Treaty came into force, and that the mere performing of an act that ought to have happened earlier was not a violation of constitutional rights. The verdict admits that the abandoned property laws have a subtext. Even though they do not say so, they actually are about the full and complete transfer of property rights, not only about liquidation and keeping money in accounts or custodian care. I call this perspective the idealist one because it argues with and for the unwritten subtext of the law. The first minority verdict, by contrast, only looks at the text of the abandoned property laws, not at their subtext. It argues that they actually do not take away the property rights of Ottoman citizens and therefore are not violating the constitution. On the other hand, it admits that their application is no longer possible after the coming into force of the Lausanne Treaty, so that is an internal contradiction. This view I call positivist because it only looks at the text of the law, ignoring its subtext. The second minority verdict is an interesting combination of both opinions. It only looks at the text of the abandoned property laws, arguing that they do not transfer any property rights, and that such a transfer can only happen through an administrative act. Unlike the majority verdict, however, it argues that such a transfer is still possible, simply because, they argue, because it is necessary. The third verdict simply ignores the question of constitutionality, thus implicitly arguing with a supra-legal necessity to take away the property rights of minorities in the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey. This third view is both idealist and promotes the right of the strong. The state can do whatever it wants. It does not need to observe the rules of constitutionality. None of the three verdicts ever discusses the question whether the abandoned property laws violated the Ottoman constitution. None of them actually opposes them or criticizes them. They represent three different strategies of not dealing with the past, all of which can still be observed in Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. That was, wow, that was a lot of information. It was very concisely put, and I think, you know, you definitely could have gone on for a while, and we could have all listened for some time. But yes, in light of the your discussion of the Lausanne Treaty, I'm just going to drop in the chat if anyone has any interests, the website for the ongoing Lausanne project, which I'm sure you're aware of, but just if anyone had any further interest in pursuing that. And I believe we also have a question in the chat. So from Charity, did these actions and laws also affect the Kurds within Turkey?
Yes, thank you for the question. As far as I know, no. So the laws issued during the First World War and also up to the very early years of the Republic, that is until 1924, they targeted Christians. Kurds at that point were part of the Ottoman elite, as part of, or the elite Kurds were part of the Ottoman elite, and the ordinary Kurdish population was part of the Muslim population. Alevis were ignored. From 1925 onwards, so there was this big Kurdish rebellion against the Republic. From that point onward, there are anti-Kurdish laws, and there is a big campaign of sending elite Kurdish people into exile and so on. But interestingly, their property of the big Kurdish families was never really taken away from them. They were able to return there in the 40s and 50s.
Okay. Eleanor, could I just ask you to stop screen sharing so we can see
Ah,
our
oh
our
yeah,
whole audience, so it's just
sure.
easy for me to tell. So if
Yes.
anyone does have questions for Eleanor, you are free to drop them in the chat or use the raise hand function. And I do have a hand up from Caroline, so if you'd like to go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, that was wow. That was amazing. I don't know how you keep track of it all. No wonder the people trying to deliver this justice, so-called, were not able to. So, I mean, I remember, I'm a bit out of touch now, but I mean, several years ago, there were certainly a number of ongoing cases, particularly in relation to the Greek Orthodox population. Armenians, I know less about. You know, we knew lawyers pursuing these cases. So what was the basis on which these cases were being pursued at that time? And are there still ongoing cases today for the property when the past is obviously so confused? Is that something that falls within your, you know, your competence? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's.
Yeah, thank you. It's something I don't really research because I'm a historian and I like to work with things that are older than 30 years. But of course, I do follow the news. There was this very famous case of the, well, several. I think the most prominent case is the one of the Syriac monastery. Mor Gabriel.
Yeah.
With a very similar case. So it was recorded as part of a Muslim waqf, and then there were objections, and a court case was filed. And I think the last information I found was that it was actually returned, and the Turkish administration said, "Oh, we made a mistake. Oh, so sorry." Actually, it's a much longer history. It's also I have my very last screen is with a bibliography, and there's a very wonderful book by Zerrin Özlem Biner. She's an anthropologist, and she studied this property issue in an area around Mardin where there's lots of Syriac people. It includes the Mor Gabriel case, but also individual landowners and how they struggle to get their property back. For the Greeks, well, we always know about the prominent cases, like the priest school on Hebeliada, which I think has been reopened. And there are, I don't know how many cases that are being reviewed by the European Court for Human Rights. And what happens in these cases is usually that Turkey is, is found to be guilty and has to pay fines, which they pay. But often they do not reverse the actions that actually the court case came about. So it's a very, it's not really a, how do you say, the European Court of Justice is a good way for getting a case publicized and to get public attention. It has not been opened as yet. Okay, thank you. But the Turkish state, as in this case here, as in this verdict, it will eventually just ignore these verdicts.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, so as Michael has dropped in the chat, the seminary hasn't been opened as yet. And also a very interesting comment where says he knows an Italian family whose farmland was confiscated during the Second World War and believes they never received any compensation. Am I right?
I'm not surprised.
So I thought it was very interesting when you say you follow the news, because when you mentioned the controversial article in Hurriyet, I was like, oh, I read Hurriyet. That's one of the places I read. I read Turkish news. So I'm going to abuse chair's privilege and ask a little question of my own, because you gave a very kind of good overview of all the sort of the laws and the treaties and all those conditions as they laid out. I was wondering if you had found or you managed to locate or get any access to maybe personal sources as narratives, like personal experiences of maybe diaries, letters of people who had lost property, claimed property, being compensated, or just anyone involved. Or is that kind of not really something the archives hold, or is it something you'd maybe be finding via personal networking, or do those kind of sources exist for this material?
Thank you for the question. They certainly exist. There are 2 or 3 problems that I'm facing with these. First of all, I don't read Greek and I don't read Armenian.
Okay.
So I cannot read the native languages of most of these people. Most descendants, grandchildren, and so on, often they speak French and English and so on. So it is possible to access family histories by talking to people, to children and grandchildren. But if people hold diaries or anything like that, I cannot read them. There's very interesting work being done by several of my colleagues, for instance, by Ümit Kurt, who has written a wonderful book about the dispossession of the Armenians of Antep, and he includes lots of Armenian sources. It includes, for instance, the diary of an Armenian man who was forced to work on one of these abandoned property commissions. So he documented the corruption during that process of selling off all these assets. And also a variety of other EQ documents. It's a very interesting book. There's also an upcoming book by Mehmet Polatel, who is also covering the 1890s and the dispossession that took place there. What I have seen are hundreds of letters that are kept in the Western archives, so especially in the NARA archive in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and also in London, and a little bit in Germany and in the Politisches Archiv of Auswärtiges Amt. So these are letters that people who were naturalized citizens of either the US or the British Empire wrote to their embassies or consulates asking for help in getting their property back.
Okay.
And both the Americans and the British basically said, "We are very sorry, we cannot help you here because we want to have good relations with Turkey."
I see.
They really consciously decided not to pursue this.
Mm.
And there are folders full of very heartbreaking attempts by people to get their property back.
Yeah, kind of like petition style letters, as it were.
There must also be petitions to the Turkish government. The petitions I've seen are those by refugees who came from, so by Muslim people. The dog came in. No? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I suppose when you mention sort of talking to maybe sort of the children and the grandchildren, that could potentially add a kind of oral history aspect to your research. But, yes. Michael says, I think the Italian embassy told the family in question that he mentioned before they could not go to war against Turkey for
such a minor matter.
For the property case, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So I think this is well, it's kind of a tragedy. As I mentioned, these elites, the Young Turks, especially Talat Pasha, of course, but also parts of his generation, they grew up with this in this situation of being a formerly sovereign state, which was pushed around all the time. So by the great powers, and they were not totally unjustified in thinking that minorities, if they still existed, would always be a pretext for a great power intervention into their own affairs. But the thing is that with the Russian Revolution, Russia was no longer interested in interfering in Turkish affairs. Well, they were again in 1948, but until then, in the 20s and 30s, they were quite friendly to Turkey, and without Russian Bolshevik support, they would never have won that war. The independence war. So in a way, the situation they were so afraid of had disappeared anyway.
I see.
And all the other great powers were no longer interested. As this Italian case, they were not interested in jeopardizing their good relations with Turkey for people who had been dispossessed.
We've got another question in the chat from Ahmed. He says, apologies, he was a little bit late, so he's not sure if you mentioned the confiscation of the property of the Muslim population despite the 1013 Athens Agreement. I trust that makes sense to you.
You mean the 1912 agreement? Or what? Or after the exchange agreement?
Ahmed, did we mean 1912? 1913, yes, it was
Yeah.
a typo. Yeah.
Yes, this is something, I haven't mentioned this particular agreement, but I have mentioned that all these policies of taking away people's property, of wanting them out, they were not invented in Turkey, they were invented in Balkan countries. So yes, this was an important experience for the young Turks, and they kind of, well, they learned the lessons there, but they took it to a next level. This is also something I said, maybe you heard it. I think it makes a difference whether you dispossess a minority and force them out, which is what Serbia did, what Bulgaria did, what Greece did with its Muslim populations, or whether you actually kill a large number of them. And also drive out the survivors.
Yes, I mean,
it's a difference. Yeah.
You did emphasize that sort of dispossession is not a sort of a modern phenomenon, and it, you know, really wasn't to do with sort of Islam or any kind of a pre-modern tradition per se.
Yes, I think that's important. So I mean, it's just, you know, important to say this is, I'm not intending to make an Orientalist argument. This is a modern case. This is a modern state with modern problems, coming up with very modern answers that are not unique to Muslim societies. To the contrary, they're all connected to the modern notion of property rights and of, you know, and how this idea of nationalism and liberalism always clashes in practice.
Yeah. So once again, if anyone has any questions, do drop in the chat or use the raise hand function. I just wanted to ask quickly about in terms of the geographical locations of these properties that are under discussion, do we find that sort of certain minorities would like cluster in communities in certain areas, or would they be more sort of spread out and integrated in the modern period, the properties in question?
Yes, there's actually, I looked for a map that I like to use for teaching and I didn't find it. So present day Turkey had different clusters of different ethnic groups. So along all the coasts, you would have lots of Greek Orthodox people. Then to the east, you would have many Armenians and many Kurds. And of course, the Kurds are still there. The Syriacs would be in the very south, around Mardin. And Armenian communities would be spread, well, the big Armenian communities, especially peasant communities, they were in the east. So the famous 6 vilayets. But there were lots of Armenian smaller communities who would usually be in small towns where they would perform trades.
Okay.
Yeah, that's, yes. And Muslims would not be, well, there was also traditional division of labor. So Muslims were not usually working in trades connected to the sea. This would always be Greeks.
Okay.
So there are divisions like this.
Okay. All very interesting. Thank you, Eleanor. Does anyone have any more questions at all? Or I always think if there's sort of no or very few questions, then you've completely explained everything and everyone completely understands, and it's just it was just, you know, my old mentor used to say silence will be taken as absolute agreement and complete comprehension. So we can assume a little bit of that here. So once again, we'll thank Eleanor for her fantastic talk, and thank you all for joining us this evening. And we hope to see you again at some of our next ATS events. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and the opportunity.
Thank you, Eleanor. That was wonderful. Thank you for joining us, everyone. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.